I think there will be a class going on, right? So we'll just wait for a while.
Hello, sir.
Yeah,
Sir, what will be a paper pattern for mid end sem exam?
the same as midsem, exactly the same, as well as the
50.
practice test. Yeah, 50 questions and 1 hour.
Okay, sir.
So I'm not sure how many would actually join. We don't have any attendance here, so there's a chance that not many people would actually join. Uh, okay, let me just wait till 11:05. Okay, so I think we can start now. Okay, so we had revised till week 2, I think, in uh, the previous week, and I'm trying my best to cover as much as I can, but I don't think so. I'll be able to probably cover the whole of syllabus by tomorrow's lecture. Um, if you would like, I can also take an extra lecture, let us say for the last lecture for Monday. That will be probably kind of a common lecture for both sections. But let us see how much we can cover till tomorrow, and then we'll see. Okay, so let's start. So the first thing we talked about when it came to conditionals was this, that there is a concept of a code block. Whatever you write between these braces, they are basically the code blocks. Okay, and a particular code block is often used in programming to actually signify that this piece of code will be executed under certain circumstances, right? So, for instance, if the if condition is true, then the code within these braces will be executed. Now, as such, code blocks are executed from the first statement till the last statement until you have a branch somewhere, right? So you have a branching statement. So what is a branching construct? A simple branching construct would basically be required when you are trying to write different pieces of code to be executed when there are different conditions within your program, right? So uh, for example, in the quadratic equation case, we knew that there were three cases based on the value of discriminant, and you wanted to execute it only when the value of d was following a certain condition. So there had to be some kind of branching in the logic that you required, right? So this is the most common way of doing branching using the if condition. You write a condition and then put it inside an if construct, and then this is the overall idea. If these are the statements right before if, and this is the statement right after if statement if construct, you basically introduce another code block, and you say that if this condition is true, then the execution goes like this. Otherwise, if the condition is false, the execution basically ignores this block and goes ahead. Um, Similarly, you can also have an else condition. So, sorry, like, yeah, else condition. Else is not really condition, but basically, whatever happens if the if condition was not true. So then you have two blocks here, this and this. And if C is true, the execution goes on like this. Otherwise, it goes on like this. And there can be also an if else if ladder, so something like this, where you basically have an if followed by else if followed by, let us say, a number of else ifs, and then you can probably end it with an else. So what will really happen is that only one of these blocks will be executed, the others will not be executed. Some things about these if conditions. The operators that you use to write these conditions, the operators for making comparisons, they they have to, you have to be very careful that you do not use, let us say, equal to in place of double equal to, because in some languages you will actually receive an error for this, but in C and C++, you will not receive an error. So there is a chance that you might actually do something stupid like this. So please, like, be careful whenever you use double equal to as well as equal to. Double equal to is a comparison operator, and so this is another point, that if you are just having a single statement within a block, you can forego the braces. You can write it like this. Another thing that is there is that you can merge these conditions with the help of campercent and logical and logical or and logical not, like this. And by the way, there was one more point I think I forgot. Yeah, this part, that these comparison operators, they actually have lower precedences as compared to your arithmetic operators. The reason for this would be, let us say, if you write something like x double equal to y by 2, you could be sure that y by 2 will be executed first, right? So so that, I mean, that is the idea, that arithmetic operators have to have higher precedences over these comparison operators. So you don't need any parenthesis, for example, to write y by 2. Okay. Any questions? Okay. So then we went into the concept of arrays, right? So the motivating example was something like this. Let us say you have to store marks for 5 different subjects. You needed 5 different integer variables like this, and you had to take inputs and outputs like this within them, right? And this is a boring thing to do, that you have to declare variables like marks 1, marks 2, marks 3, and so on. So so we said that the data structure that you can use is basically array. You can use an ordered collection of individual variables, and they have these indices which start from 0 and move up to size -1. And the only thing that you have to be sure is that uh, array once created cannot be modified. So the number of variables that are part of an array, it remains fixed, it doesn't change. And the syntax to do that in C is something like this. You put the data type, the name of the array, and the size. Now certain compilers, especially the newer compilers, allow you to provide the size as a variable as well, but it is always good to use constants to do that, because then it will be compatible with any backward compilers as well. And one way to initialize an array is using this particular syntax. You put your initial values in braces, and separated by comma. And so the same example of marks 1, marks 2, mark 3 can now be changed to arrays, where you have a uh, 5 element array to store the marks. Now, strings are a specific type of arrays where you have a character array, and it is ended by a /0 character. Okay, so the /0 character, or the null character, is another character within C and C++. I think in Java also. Yeah, Java also. So this is used to denote the ending of a real world string. This is the idea. A string is basically a word, or a set of words, something like that. So you can use character arrays in two ways, like this. You can either write it like this, or you can, just for the case of character arrays, you can use these codes. You cannot use these codes for any other type of array. But if you use codes, the /0 character gets added by default implicitly. You don't have to write it. Okay. um, so this is a simple case of string. Here you're just creating a string which is of size 3. Actually, not size 3. It is basically a character array whose 3 elements are being used. The third element being /0. The size of the string is actually 2 only. There are some methods for string input output. Put s is a method that is used to print a string. You can also use printf with %s format specifier. You can use getS to take input for a string, but you might know that you will be getting a warning if you use it, because getS is considered to be a uh, dangerous method to use. So you guys already know that the alternative to this is using fgetS. Okay. Okay. Any queries on this? Okay. Three point three. Okay. So then we went to how we can use loops basically. So iterative programming is all about writing loops. You can if we revisit this particular example where we had declared an array, and we had used the 5 elements, we were still required to write these elements like this. The idea of using a loop is to basically come up with a solution where you have to execute the same statement multiple times with maybe some simple changes. In such a case, you write a loop to run the same statement multiple times. For instance, in this particular case, we want to use scanf. We want the scanf statement to be executed multiple times to take inputs into the multiple variables. So here we use something like a loop. And loops work something like this. You start from the top, some body gets executed, then you go to the top again, and this process continues. So basically, the control actually flows as if it is a loop. Okay, this is why we call it a loop. And why do we use loops? Well, it's pretty simple. We use it to solve the problems in which involves any kind of repetition. And this is the typical structure of a loop. There are some statements before the loop, some statements after the loop. Within the loop, this is known as the loop body. You basically have some variables which you initialize to certain values, and you use these variables to write your loop's body, so that different iterations, when these variables have different values, the execution of the statement gives you a different result. Then you update these values. Usually you update them after each iteration, but sometimes you can also it update them in a different fashion. And you also need a condition to figure out whether you are supposed to stay in the loop or come out of it. So this is a general concept of how a loop works. This is a simple example of a factorial. This is just reducing the value of the number and multiplying it with its previous result till now. Any questions still here? Okay. So I'm just going at a very high pace because we've seen most of it. We are just I'm just giving you a overall overview, right? I mean, so that it's easier for you to prepare for the exams. So in C and in most of the languages, you'll at least find three types of loops: while, do while, and for. So in while, this is what happens basically. Let me go back. So in while, this is what happens. This condition that in do while, the condition that we write in order to keep the control within the loop is written towards the end, right? And this is where do while becomes a slightly more uh, different loop as compared to while and for, because do while will always execute at least once because the condition is checked towards the end of the loop. So this is how it looks like in C. There is a do keyword, then there is a body. Of course, if you have just single statement, you do not need these phrases. But if you have more than one statement, you have to put it inside braces. This will be a block, and the condition is written at the end of the loop. So one thing is quite sure, that do while loop will always execute at least once because the condition is put at the end. So this is the same factorial example using do while. So another way, in another place where this condition can be put is at the top, and when you put the condition on the top, it becomes a while loop. So the condition is checked first, and only then, if the condition is true, then the rest of the statements of the loop get executed. So this is how it looks like: while, the condition to stay in the loop, and then the statements. So it is quite possible that if the condition is false, the body is never executed at all. So this is the same factorial function using while loop. Um, so by the way, this is again one of the most common misconceptions. It doesn't mean that do while loop will always execute one more time as compared to the while loop. No, the only thing that is there is that do while loop will be executed at least once. Okay, so the the only difference between while and do while comes when the loop condition is false at the beginning itself. In that case, the while loop will not execute, but the do while loop will execute. That is the only difference. But other than that, they are basically exactly the same. This is, I think, we have discussed. Any questions on this? Okay. Okay, so then the other loop.
Sir, 1 minute.
Yeah.
Sir, how will we judge when to use what loop? When use for loop, when do while, or when only while loop? How do
So
we
the
judge?
best, yeah. So usually, all these three loops are, first of all, all these three loops are equivalent to each other. So any code can be written using any of the loops. Um, but over a period of time, you will realize that there are certain use cases where using one loop over the other just seems more natural. Okay. The example for is for do while loop is that wherever you are trying to do something that needs to be done at least once, and then you repeat it, right? So for example, do while loop in general is used most commonly for taking user preferences towards the end of some tasks. Okay, so you say, you present a menu to the user, and the user has to pick some operations. Okay, now the user picks the choices, the operation is done. But you now want to ask the user whether you would like to repeat the whole process. So then you ask the user for the choice towards the end. If the user says yes, you go back to the start of the loop and you do everything again. So the reason for this is that you at least want to allow the user to perform those operations at least once. Okay, and from there onwards it's more like, do you want to continue, do you want to continue. So this is the best place to use do while loops. For loops are usually used for cases where you are absolutely sure that this is the exact number of times I want my loop to run, right? So the typical case is when you are trying to browse through an array, let us say. So if an array is of size n, you simply use I equal to 0 to I less than n, because then it's a very systematic and natural way to read the code, that you know that this loop is going to run n times. So for loops are used where we are absolutely sure that the number of times this loop will run is exactly x or y. For all other conditions where there is a subjective condition, which till that particular subjective condition is true, you want the loop to continue. That is where you use the while loop. Okay, something like while x is double equal to y, and then you have some ways in which x and y can change within the body. So as long as, let us say, x is double equal to y, or x is not equal to y, or some other condition. So basically, for generic conditions where it's not really about the number of times, but basically the number of times could be dependent on a particular subjective condition, people usually use while loops. For loops are, as I said, the best use of for loops is whenever you are doing operations over arrays. And do while loops are usually used where you have to put up these menus kind of stuff, where the user is expected to give you a preference towards the end, something like that. But as I said, these are all common use cases. If for instance you are a fan of do while loop, you can use do while loop for all the stuff. Or if you are a fan of for loop, you can use for loop to do everything. So that is the idea. Any other
Thank you,
queries?
sir.
Yeah, any other queries,
Thank you.
guys? Okay, so let's like have a look at the for loop again. So one of the best things about for loop is its compact syntax. Okay, we saw that there are certain things that you are expected to do inside a loop. For instance, you probably would like to initialize certain variables. You have to write a condition. As long as this condition is true, you remain in the loop. When the condition is false, you get out of the loop. And maybe after every iteration you would like to change the values of these variables by some amount. So overall, this is where the for loop becomes a uh, very convenient loop to use, because of its syntax. So the idea is like this: there are three sections: initialization, condition, and update, and then the statements. So initialization is only executed once. So that is, you have to understand that it doesn't get executed every time. It is not really a part of the loop's body. It is not. It is only executed once. The condition part is executed right before the next iteration starts. Okay. So basically, right before the first iteration, the condition is checked. If the condition is true, then the iteration goes through, otherwise it doesn't go through. And update is executed right after a particular iteration ended. Okay, so so the actual flow goes something like this: you are here, then you go here, then you go here, then the loop executes, and then the update executes. And then if the condition is false, you come out of the loop, something like this. So this I think we have already discussed. This is a typical example of using a for loop. You have you are basically going through the indices of an array, and you're using the variable I to do that. Now this is another issue that in some compilers the scope of I is basically within this loop only. So I is not really available right after this particular loop. In some compilers, I is just treated like a typical local variable, so you will be able to access it even after the loop has ended. So that is for this is something that is associated with the compilers today. I in general declare my variables at the top of the function itself, so that those things are now those compiler specific stuff is not going to affect my program. Another issue with for loop is that you can actually leave actually all three of the elements of the for loop: initialization, condition, as well as update. They can be left alone, left empty. So this makes the part a little tricky. If the condition part is basically empty, the problem is that it is treated by default as true. Okay, so this is the difference between while and do while and for. You cannot leave the parenthesis empty in while and do while. You have to write at least one, for example, within that. But with for, just an empty semicolon, a null statement can also be used. And by default, it is interpreted as the condition part is interpreted as one. So it is true, always true. So if you want to break out of such a loop, you have to put something here, let us say a break statement within the loop. Okay. So then there is a plus plus operator. I know that this has been the talk for a lot of pain for you guys, that how exactly these plus plus operators take they are, how exactly do they operate. The only thing that you need to remember with these plus plus operators is that as long as you are using them, as long as you are making change to a particular variable only once in an expression or a statement, it is very easy to figure out how they will behave, right? The problem is when you try to use them multiple times within the same expression, then it is not possible to predict it easily, that what will be the final effect of it. So but as long as you are using it uh, only once in an expression, then this is all that you need to remember. So for instance, if you have written something like this, it is actually equivalent to writing this. So because it is plus plus I, it essentially means increment first and then use. So this is equivalent to writing I equal to I plus 1 and j equal to k into I minus 1. Similarly, the postfix plus plus, I plus plus, means that use and then increment. So then this is what it looks like. You basically use the original value of I first, and then you increment it like this. So as long as you're using them only once in your expression, there is no problem. This is exactly how you can interpret them. The problem is when you start using them multiple times in an expression, then it is tricky. It is tricky to tell exactly what will be the output. Any questions on this?
Sir, please repeat the break statement again.
Break part, we'll have a look at break part. We will come to it right now. That was just to give you an idea that if you write a for without a condition, then you'll have to use a break to come out of it. But we'll come to break. Any questions on this? Okay.
Sir, one
Yeah.
question.
Yeah.
Sir, as we know that the program goes from left to right and top to down. So when this statement is executed, j equal to k into plus plus I, we would go like first we would assign a variable memory j, and then start multiplying k into I. But at that point we would come to know that we have to do this before the statement. So will the operation occur once again or something?
No. First of all, the memory allocation part is different. Are you trying to say the memory allocation as in creation of space for J, or uh, you're talking about the,
No, sir.
yeah, go ahead.
Memory is not the problem here. I'm asking about like we would come to know that it's plus plus I after we come to that part of the statement. First, it would go from J, then
Okay.
it
No. So basically, what happens is like this. When the left to right part is basically to make you understand how the evaluation takes place, but the actual evaluation doesn't take it like this. Take place like this. So basically, you have something known as a tree. An expression tree. Okay. So for every expression that you write in your program, when the compiler compiles it, an expression tree is created. Okay, in that tree you know everything about, like, so there is a root, and then there are branches and leaves. Okay, so in that tree the root is aware of what are there, what things are there in the branches and the leaves. Okay, so you don't have to worry about it. The idea of left to right evaluation, it only means that if there are two operators and they are having the same precedence, in most cases the operator on the left is executed first. So the expression tree is made in such a way that the left operator gets executed first and the right operator gets executed the next. But that doesn't mean that the right, you have no idea about what is going to come up. Okay, this whole expression.
so
Yeah.
yes, sir, I got that. So the tree would be made during compilation.
Yes. It is a part of
Okay,
your
sir, thank you.
compilation process. Yeah. Any other queries, guys? Okay. And you will read about these trees when you study compilers. Or I think some of you who may have attended Avanish's lecture, I think he did talk about these trees, but I then told him that they don't know about trees as of now. Anyhow. So in this part, we will talk about the break statement, as someone was pointing out. Okay, so the conditionals that we saw before was just if and else. This was how if will go through, and this is how if and else both will go through, right? Now we also saw something known as the if else if ladder. So something like this. Let us say if I have a particular variable called year, if it has value 1, I should execute something. If it has value 2, 3, and 4, I should execute something else, so on and so forth. So basically I have an if else if ladder, but that is based on the different values of the same variable. So for such use cases, only such use cases, um, most languages also give you another construct, and that construct is the switch case construct. The idea of a switch case construct is that you put a particular variable, you switch a particular variable, and then you write some cases. Okay, the cases actually mean what you should do, what statement should be executed if this particular variable has currently this particular value. So this is the idea of a switch case. The overall, and you also have a default case. Okay, in default case is executed if this particular variable does not have any of these values. Default, by the way, is optional. It's not necessary that you give a default, but if you give a default, it will be executed if if uh, none of the cases defined are basically matching. So then you simply say use the default. This is how a switch case looks like. You now have a block for each of the cases, just like you have a block for if, just like you had a block for else. You now have a code block. It is not really a code block. I mean, you don't put it in braces and everything, but similar to a code block. This is how it looks like. Um, The problem though is that, as I said, right, they are not really different code blocks, but basically labels within a code block. So once any particular case becomes true, the cases that are defined right after that, and the case after that, and the case after that, they'll all be executed in that particular order. So this is why order in which you are defining your cases actually matter. Okay, because if a particular case goes, if a particular case becomes true, all the cases below that, the statements for those cases are also executed like this. Now how do we stop this if we want cases to be executed independently and not not in the way that everything defined after a particular case is also executed? To stop that, we use the break statement. So this is the idea, that at the end of a particular set of statements, if you put a break, what really happens is that break is going to take you out uh, of the innermost switch or loop. Okay, the innermost part is very important here. So if you have a switch case inside another switch case, or a loop inside another loop, if a break statement is encountered, you will just go out of the innermost switch or the innermost loop. You won't go outside all of them, right? So this is the idea, that here, if a break statement is encountered, it will go right here, okay, just after this particular ending braces. Okay, it will not go here, for example. So, and you can also use these switch cases in such a way that the idea that a particular case that follows another case will be executed whenever this case is matched. You can use this idea to club your cases intelligently like this, right? So basically here, uh, irrespective of what the value is, 2, 3 or 4, this is the actual statement that gets executed. So this is a kind of a trick that people use when they use switch cases. If there are a certain set of cases for which you have to write the same code, you basically write them in that particular order, one after the other, and then you put the statements, and then you put a break statement. The innermost part is important because basically of this, right? So there no let me just tell you what is nesting first. If you put a particular construct of a particular type within the construct of the same type, you call it nesting. Nesting is a typical it's a typical concept. Okay, it's not really something that is specific to C. It is a programming concept, the concept of nesting, putting one construct within another instance of the same construct. So this is, for example, known as a nested if. This is a nested switch case. Okay, you can see that I've written a switch case within the body of another case, and this is like a for loop within another for loop, a loop within a loop. So the idea is, whenever you put a break, it will only take you out of the innermost loop or the innermost switch. So if I put a break here, it will not break out of this switch, for example. Or if I put a break here, it will not break out of this for loop, for example. Can you guys see my mouse pointer? Sorry, I hope you can, because I've been using it. Uh,
Yes, sir.
okay. So then, so breaks can also be used for putting your loop terminating conditions within the body. So for example, here I have the while loops condition is 1, right? It means that this is basically a kind of infinite loop. But in order to break out of it, I can also put a condition within the loop's body. So this is a common thing that we do. Many a times we write the loop condition to be always true, and then we write break statements within the body of your loop, to break out of it whenever something happens. Okay, so this is a common thing that people do. I do it very often, because sometimes I don't know for what should be the case to this is usually when we are going to write a very complicated loop. So in the beginning you just put the condition to be 1, and then you keep on writing it, and then you say, okay, under certain peculiar cases only will I would like to break out of this loop. So in this case, this break statement is very effective. Similarly to the break statement, we also have a less used but available construct called the continue statement. The continue statement simply takes your current control to the end of your body, and your next iteration starts straight away. Okay, so it is something like this. If you encounter a continue here, after execution of continue, your control basically goes to this particular bracket. Okay, and then whatever is required, the next iteration, it simply starts the next iteration. Of course, the conditions will be checked and everything, but the idea of a continue statement is to simply say, okay, end of the body, and now go back to the top. That is the idea of a continue statement. It is not used very often, but it is there. So any questions on this? Okay. Sure, just a minute. Shared. Okay. So now, once you actually understand the concept of iteration and the use of arrays, there are so many problems in programming that you can resolve, you can solve, right? And uh, arrays basically have two very basic operations, and these operations are used very often. So if you actually understand these operations, you can basically use arrays for a number of things. Okay. So the first common case, but a common operation of arrays is to actually do sorting. So this is an example where you have, let us say, a set of cards. Okay, this is a real world example that if you're playing cards, you hold your cards like this, and then one of the things that you would like to do is sort them in increasing or decreasing order of the card's value. So one way to do that is basically you pick up the card number 2, and then you simply put it at the beginning, and then you pick up the next smallest number, the next smallest card, you pick it out, and then you put it at the right place, so on and so forth, right? So basically this is one way in which you can actually sort your cards. What we were really doing here are essentially two operations, insertion and deletion. So insertions in arrays, it is an operation where you actually add a new value to your array, provided that of course it has space to accommodate a new value. So the typical way to do that is something like this. You first check whether your array has any vacancies. If it has, you ask me what index should the new value go at. Let us call that index to be I. So what we do is, from I onwards, all the elements are shifted one place to the right. Basically, you are creating some space, and then the new element gets inserted at position I. Something like this. Let us say this is an array of capacity 5, and by the way, there are two terms, capacity and size. Capacity essentially means the size of the memory that you have, right? So at the time of creating your array, you created the array with a particular size, let us say. Okay, that size is essentially the capacity. This is the maximum number of values that can be housed inside your array. So capacity is essentially the highest possible value of size. That is the way to look at capacity. And size essentially means that currently only these many number of elements in my array are worthy, are I only consider them to be the content. Rest everything is basically garbage for me. So in this particular case, you can say that this element x, okay, it means that I don't care what that element is. There is certainly some value stored there, but from the perspective of my application, this array only has 4 elements. This is the idea. So then I receive a request to insert something. Someone has a question. Okay. So So then let us say get a request to insert something. It says insert the value 20 at index 1. So now I becomes 1. So what I do is I basically have to remove everything. I have to shift everything from index 1 up to the last index. So I basically do it like this. I start from the end of the array. I keep on shifting these values one by one to the right, and then I finally have that particular index I as vacant, and then I insert the new element here. So this is the simple case of insertion. Okay, this is just the C code for it. This is the loop where you shift the elements to the right, and then this is where you add the element to the array. Similarly, in deletion, the first thing of course you have to check is whether the array has any elements in it or not. If you do have elements, you ask for the index from which the index at which the element is present currently, which you want to delete, and then in insertion we shifted elements to the right. In deletion, we basically shift elements to the left. Okay, so from I+1 index onwards, everything gets shifted to the left, and then the last index, the current size wherever it is, at that point we just, let us say, put an X. We say don't care kind of thing. So this is the example. You have you get a request to delete the element at index 1. So this is index 1, and then what you do is you basically shift everything to the left. Okay, now the last element, basically you really don't care what it is, right? So I just reduce the size to 4, and I say that I have deleted that particular value. And this is the code for deletion. This is the loop where you shift elements to the left, and then you decrease the size. Now, insertion sort is a kind of sorting where you use these insertions and deletion methods in order to sort a particular array. The idea is something like this. At any point of time, you basically divide your array into two imaginary parts. So you're not really dividing it. You're basically saying that my array has two parts. Okay, there is a sorted part, and then there is an unsorted part. The sorted part means that all the elements in that particular part of the array are in increasing, or let us say decreasing order, some order. In the unsorted part, the elements could be in any particular order, and at each, in each iteration, you basically pick one element from the unsorted part and then insert it at its correct position. Okay, in the order in the sorted part. So this is the whole concept of an insertion sort. um, this is a simple example. In the beginning, you basically say that only the first element is the sorted part, and then the rest of it is unsorted. So because uh, one element by default, right, and one element array is sorted by default. Okay, there's just no way it can be unsorted. So and then from there onwards, what you do, you basically pick up one element from your unsorted array. Now this could be any element, by the way, but usually what we do is we pick up the first element of the unsorted part of the array, and then we try to insert it at its correct position in the sorted array. So in this case, of course, the correct position is this only. And by the way, you can see that these two parts are fluid in nature, right? So their sizes get decreased and increased uh, as and when I want, right? So so after one iteration, I say that the size of the unsorted part has decreased by 1, and the size of the sorted part has increased by 1. Okay, and let us say both have capacity equal to the capacity of the array. Then in the next iteration, I pick up 13, and then 13 has to be inserted between 10 and 20. So then 20 has to be shifted to the right, okay, to make space for 13 to be inserted, and then 13 gets inserted here. So essentially, to see it in terms of the insertion and deletion operations, I first delete 13 from the array, and then insert it at look at index 1. This is how you should imagine what is happening, right? And then the same thing can be done with 9. 9 comes here, and then the same thing can be done for 5. 5 comes here. At one point of time, your unsorted part will become 0, and then it means that your complete array is sorted. So this is insertion sort. Now, with how to search within an array, one way to search for a particular value within an array is to simply start from the beginning and go through it one by one. But let us say if you have a sorted array, you can also do a much better job, where the idea is something like this. Let us say you check what is the current value at a particular index, any index, okay, within the array. uh, because the array is sorted, you know that all the values to the left of this index have to be smaller than the value at this particular index, and similarly all the values to the right of this index have to be greater than the value of this index. So if I compare the value at this particular index with my search key, there can be three possibilities. First of all, it could be that the value is exactly at the same position that I'm looking for, or the value to be searched is smaller than the value at this index. So it means that the only chance that I have for this particular value to be in the array will be when I move to the left. Similarly, if the value to be searched is greater than this current value, the only positions where it can be found in the array is towards the right. So I can then move either left or right, and if I pick this I to be the midpoint of the part of the array that I am currently searching in, I call this to be the binary search. Okay, so at each point of time I divide my array into two parts. um, I either the left part or the right part, and I can be absolutely sure that the value that I am searching for has to be either in the left or in the right part. So this is a simple example. This is a sorted array, and let us say I have to search 9 here. In the beginning, I will check at the midpoint of the array. This I see that 9 is less than 10. So now at this point, I know that it is not possible at all for 9 to be present in this part of the array, because it is a sorted array. If this element is 10, all the elements to the right will be greater than 9. The only possibility of finding 9 is if I check to the left, and so then I move to the left. I just keep on checking. In the next iteration I checked at 5. Now I know that 9 can only be on the right, so then I go here and then I find 9. So this is the idea. There are some other sorting algorithms as well, like bubble and selection sort. Any questions on this? Okay, I think I'll just cover one more. Well, okay, I have two parts to I'll have to move fast now.
So,
Okay.
sir, searching and binary searching is same, or is the
So,
binary
so
searching is
when
special? Hmm.
yeah, basically searching, when people say just the word searching, it could see, linear search is applicable to all searches. We call it linear search when we search from the beginning and go up to the end. We call it linear search, and linear search can be done for all arrays. Binary search can only be done for the arrays that are sorted. So the term searching in general refers to linear search. If you are talking about binary search, you will have to tell me binary search,
Okay, sir. Clear.
because binary search is only applicable to sorted arrays. Okay. Any other queries? Okay, let's just go through this very fast. The arrays that we discussed before were basically one-dimensional arrays. So let us say if I had to store marks for 5 courses, I created an array of size 5. But if I, let us say, want to store marks for more than one student, I'll just have to use some other mechanism. So for instance, I'll have to store these values in an array of size n cross 5, right? So let us say for 4 students I'll have to create an array of size 20. But before that, you have to actually understand the concept of contiguous memory allocation. I think you guys already know it, that the contiguous means one after the other. So whenever you create an array, the memory location that is assigned to this particular variable is basically contiguous. So if you create an array of size 5, 4 cross 5, 20 bytes it's basically a block of memory that gets allocated for your variable within the memory. And let us say if the starting address of this block is 1000, ARR 1 points to 1004, ARR 2 points to 1008, and so on. Basically, this is the formula, that ARR plus I into address of the single, the size of a single element. Now, one way to handle the cases of multiple students is to actually create arrays of size n cross 5, right? Let us say you have n students, you create an array of size n cross 5, and then you use it like this. The first 5 elements are for student 1, the next 5 elements are for student 2, so on and so forth. Another way is to basically create a two-dimensional array, where I define another dimension of this array like this, and the basically the memory that gets allocated is exactly the same. You still get n into 5 into, let us say, 4 bytes of memory, but you can actually interpret it in a different fashion. You can visualize it in a different fashion, something like this. Let us say you have these this is a one-dimensional representation of the same memory, and this is a two-dimensional representation of the same memory. Here I have a total of 15 elements. Of course, in the actual memory they are stored like this only, but to visualize them, this is actually helpful, because now I can say that two different indices mean two different things, right? I'll say the first index actually represent students, and the second index represents the marks. So it is much easier for me to use two-dimensional arrays, because I can easily visualize the code and use the code as compared to using a single dimensional array of the same number of elements. So this is a simple example. Here I am using an array of size n cross 5, a single dimensional array, and here I am using a two-dimensional array of n and 5 dimensions. So the first index basically tells you the student number, the second index tells you the subject number, and it is much easier to understand this code as compared to the other code. Okay, any questions on this? Okay, we just have one more. Let us just do it fast. Okay, so one of the things that you have to understand is that whenever a particular integer is represented in the memory, it is nothing more than just some zeros and ones. So for example, if you want to represent 10, 10 in binary is 1010, and if you want to represent it in 8 bits, you just add some leading zeros to it, and this is what is the representation of 10 in 1 byte. For negative numbers, there are multiple ways in which they can be represented. The most common representation that is used is known as the 2's complement representation. You'll study more about it when you study switching theory. Another very simple way of representing the numbers is to use the sign magnitude form. In sign magnitude form, you actually reserve one particular bit as the bit for your sign. In this case, you do so let us say 0 means positive and 1 means negative. So in this case, minus 10 will be represented like this, right? So you basically get put a 1 here, and then the rest is as it is. So the overall idea is that you only use 7 bits to represent the magnitude, and then 1 bit is used to represent the sign. In real valued, as far as real valued numbers are concerned, they are stored in a completely different fashion. There are two components, a mantissa as well as an exponent. So to understand, just to give you a brief idea, let us say you want to represent 12.5 in terms of binary. This is the binary representation of 12.5, 1100.1. And so if you go back to the cases of scientific notation, basically you bring the decimal point right before so that you basically move the decimal point so that there is only one digit that is on the left of the decimal point. So one way to write this is something like this. This is not really 11, this is basically 3, right? And the base is 2 because we are talking about binary system and not the decimal system. So the same number can be written like this. Now, the difference between scientific notations is that in scientific notation, the digit here could be anything starting from 1 to 9. Here we only have the possibility of 1. Okay, the only number that can come, the only digit that can be here is just 1, right? Because there are only two digits, 0 and 1, and we would like to bring it to a position where the left digit is non-zero, so the only possibility left is 1. So basically I do not really need to know this part. Okay, this is kind of implicit, that whenever I change it to this form, the first two locations will be 1 and dot. So what I need to store is just this part. Okay, and I need to store this part. So if I have these two values, I can actually regenerate this, and then with the help of this I can actually interpret it like this. So this is the idea. This is known as the mantissa, and this is known as the exponent. This is mantissa, and this is my exponent. So real valued numbers are stored like this. You have to store the mantissa separately, the exponent separately, and then they, for both, you also have to have the uh, you know uh, the 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 sign bits are there. So there are so many things that are there. It's a very complicated arrangement. I'm not going to go into details because you will study more about this when you study computer organization. The so one of the major problems with computers is that if each variable has to have a range. Why range? Because we only have a fixed number of bits, zeros and ones, and for n bits you can only represent 2 to the power n different combinations. So in irrespective of how many bytes you are using, each and every variable has a particular range, because it cannot represent any value beyond that. So for example, if you have 8 bits, if you're trying to represent the values in 8 bits, they are basically only 2 to the power 8, that is 256 possibilities. Similarly, so this is how your actual range looks like. If you are having a 2-byte integer, it could either range from here to here, or it could range like from here to here, based on whether it is signed or unsigned. Signed means it could be minus or negative, it could be negative or positive, or unsigned means that they are just positive numbers. um, for conversion of types, C will implicitly convert the lower type, the type with lower ranges to the types with higher ranges. So for example, if you have a short and an int in a particular expression, the short gets implicitly converted to int, and then the computation takes place. If you let us have a float and and an integer, then integer gets typecasted to float. You can also do these typecasting explicitly by putting the type of the data type within parentheses and putting it right before the expression. uh, the size of operator will actually give you the size in the number of bytes that a particular variable or an expression takes up. You can actually use it to find out things like this. So let us say, here my uh, you know here actually the int, float and double is being used with size of. It will give you 4, 4 and 8. And then here I is an integer, c is the character, so this whole thing becomes implicitly an integer. So that is why the size is 4 bytes. Here one is integer, the other is float. Actually it will be float only, but because float and integer are both 4 bytes, you will see 4. Here there is one integer and one double. Integer gets promoted to double, the final expression is a double, so the size of this expression is 8 bytes. Okay, any queries?
Sir, please explain again the back and continue statement.
Back and continue? Break.
Break. Sorry. Break and continue statement.
Okay, just a minute. Break and continue was here, I think. Do you guys have a class?
No, sir. We
Okay,
have
so
no
I'll
class.
just 2 minutes I'll use, and I'll just explain the break and continue part again. Conditionals. Okay. Let's start with the break first. Okay, so the break essentially does this, right? Whenever you put a break statement, it is going to get you, whenever the break statement is encountered, it is going to actually take you out of the innermost switch or the for loop wherever the break statement is found. Okay, the innermost part is important, because if there is a case of a nesting as in, you have a for within a for, you have a while within a for within a while, a switch within a while, basically any combination of switch and loops. If you have any combinations of switch and loop and there is a kind of nesting going on, in that case break is only applied to the innermost switch or innermost loop. Okay, so this is an example of what nesting looks like. This is nested if. You don't care about nested if. This is a case of nested switches, that there is a switch inside another switch and there is a for loop inside another for loop. There can be other examples too. There can be a switch inside a for loop. There can be a for loop inside a switch. The idea is, if you put a break here at this point, okay, whenever that break is encountered, you will basically go to the bracket, right? I mean, like here, you just go right after this particular closing parenthesis. You will end up here. If a break is encountered here, your control moves here. If a break is encountered here, your control moves here. So it is applied to the nearest for, nearest as in the innermost for or the innermost switch, not for, like basically any loop, do while do while or while.
Sure. So suppose if we are in means our break statement is inside two for loops, means one for loop,
Yes.
then again one for
Yeah.
loop, different break statement. So will it take us to the outermost, or to it will only cross one for
Yes.
loop?
Yeah. So basically, let us say this is the case, right? So currently, let us say you encounter a break statement here. Your your control will then move here. It will not move here, for example. Okay. So if a break is encountered here, control moves here right after this particular loop. Okay. So you will still remain inside the outer loop. Okay.
Okay, sir.
It will, you will not go outside the outer loop. It will just take you outside the inner loop. And continue statement, it is basically similar to the break statement. It is going to make a branching, but the branching doesn't go take you right outside the loop. Where will it take you? It will take you here. Let me just take. So if you encounter a continue statement here, basically you reach here. Okay, so what happens when you reach here? Right after this you have to go here, right? I mean, the update statement will be executed, the condition will be checked again. If the condition is true, you go inside the loop again. So the continue statement just takes you back to the and by the way, continue is only applicable to loops, it is not applicable to switch. So it will take you to the end of the current, it will take you to the end of the body of the current loop. Okay, the loop itself doesn't terminate. Okay, with continue the loop doesn't terminate. It just says that, okay, do not execute the body of the loop anymore from this point onwards. Okay, uh, just assume as if the body has already executed and try and prepare for the next iteration. So that is the job of continue. Continue is very rarely used. Okay, but it is there, you can use it maybe. Is it clear, guys, the difference between
Uh,
break and
yes, sir. Yes, sir.
okay? Okay, guys, any other queries?
Uh, There's a sign part. If in an 8-bit memory we allocated a leftmost box
Mhm.
for sign,
Mhm.
then the numbers should be less. Na? We
Yes, yes,
represent.
yeah, and so it reduces your range, right? I mean, it doesn't actually reduce your range. The idea is, you basically have a kind of a symmetric representation that the let me just go back to that sign represent part. Just a minute. Conversion. Is it? This one. Okay. Share. So this is the idea that what happens is something like this. Slideshow. So this is the idea that basically, let us say you have an 8-bit. Let's go back to integers. If you have 8 bits to represent your numbers, there are 2 to the power 8 different binary combinations that can be stored, right? So if you use a sign bit for the leftmost case, let us say, so this could either be 1 or 0, okay, and then the rest 7 bits actually represent your magnitude, the actual number. So 2 to the power 7 numbers can be represented in 7 bits, and you can they can all either be negative or positive, right? So it means that the total number of numbers that can be represented are 2 into 2 to the power 7,
And that
which
is
is
also 2 to the power 8.
that is 2 to the power 8. So basically you still have 2 to the power 8 representations. The problem with sign magnitude version is that if this particular part, okay, the 7 bits are all zeros, okay, then uh, still the leftmost bit could either be 0 or 1. So essentially in the sign magnitude form, you have two representations for 0, right? You have a -0 and a
Yeah.
+0, right?
Yes.
So basically
Yes.
so you waste one of those 2 to the power n patterns, right? Because you essentially have two versions for 0 which you don't need, right? So in order to avoid that, you have something known as 2's complement representation. 2's complement representation is a very peculiar representation which is very similar to the sign magnitude form, but when you'll study your switching theory, you'll realize that the advantage of 2's complement form is that 0 has the same representation. It doesn't have +0 and -0, and that is why we use 2's complement form. Okay, it's a bit tricky to talk about it. I think one day I did talk about 2's complement representation with some batch. I explained it in very brief, but let us leave the 2's complement form to your electronics teacher. They will teach you in probably switching theory or digital design, something like that. You should probably have some subject on that. I'm not sure.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, you study electronics, right? I think in the next semester as
Yeah.
well.
I don't think so, sir. We have this semester we have electronics, and I think or one semester we have electronics. I don't know which semester. But
Okay. Okay, but yeah, so this you can probably study this in computer organization also.
okay,
Okay, yeah. So you study it in computer organization then. Okay.
okay, sir. One more, the binary part. So the point was the decimal
Yeah.
point
Yeah.
and that part.
Just a minute. Yeah. So actually, again, that part too is slightly complicated, but I'll just tell you what is the issue. Basically, this is the only thing you need to understand, that if this is a
Yes,
number,
sir.
right? If
This
this
is
is a number, this is its binary representation. Now, if you remember the scientific notation, what exactly is scientific notation? You basically, let us say if I have 636, I represent it like 6.36 into 10 to
in,
the power 2, right?
yes, yes,
Right.
right.
So the same concept is here, that I had this number. If I convert it into this form, that I just have one digit prior to the dot, okay, that digit has to be non-zero, by the way. Okay, so this
Yeah,
becomes as kind of scientific notation equivalent in binary, right? And
yeah.
the exponent, it's and by the way, the base here is 2 now instead of 10, because we are talking about binary numbers. and
Binary numbers.
and this number 2 is represented, this is 3, but we are representing it in binary. Now
Binary.
the issue is, because in this is the advantage in decimal systems, I have 10 possible digits, 0 to 9, and I say that this digit has to be a non-zero digit. So there are 9 possibilities from 1 to 9, but in binary system I only have two digits, 0 and 1. So the only possible digit that could be on the left will always be 1, if I bring it in this form. So
Right.
I really don't need to store this. Okay, I can, this is like this is always the case. I can assume they are there. I don't need to store them. all I need to store is this part and this part.
Yes.
Okay, and with the
Right.
help
Right.
of this, I can reconstruct this number.
Yes, sir.
So I say this
Mhm.
part is known as mantissa and this part is known as exponent. So when I store a real number, I store these two parts separately, and there are standards as to how many bits are there for exponent, how many bits are there for mantissa. There are IEEE standards for it. That okay. So in 8-bit you reserve this much for mantissa, this much for exponent. In 16 bits you use this much for mantissa, this much for exponent, so on and so forth. So this is how you store a real number.
Okay.
Okay. Okay,
Okay.
guys, I think I have already taken up more time. It's 12. Do you guys have a class?
No, sir. No, sir.
Okay, okay. Sorry, sir. So
Thank
yeah,
thank you, sir. Tomorrow, which lectures you should
so
revise?
we'll start from week 6. I'll try to run up as much as I could, right? But I think my capacity is 3 weeks in a lecture. So there is a good
Okay.
chance that we'll be only able to cover 6, 7, and 8. So
Okay.
9, 10, and 11 will be left. If you guys want, because I could not take the Monday lecture, I am open to taking one common lecture because the total strength will probably be less than 100. Both
Right.
both batches included. So I'm open
Yeah.
to taking an extra class, guys. If you guys are interested, I can take an extra class either on Thursday or some other day, and I'll cover up the rest of the weeks as well. But I intend to cover up to week 8 tomorrow, 6 to 8.
Okay, sir.
Thank you, guys.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you, sir.